morning, boys and girls. This is Miss Reed. We are going to look at investigations, part 1, day 9, writing a testable question. Last couple of days, we've been brainstorming topics of interest that you might want to use for your science project. Today, we're going to put those topic suggestions to the test to see if we can write a testable question. So in investigations, day 9, we're going to look at writing a testable question PowerPoint together. So we're going to briefly go through it. Let's begin by watching a short video on scientific questions.
Asking questions is a vital part of the scientific process. But it's not enough to simply ask any question. Science is about asking good questions. Questions that can be answered through direct observation or with scientific tools. Questions that examine the relationships between phenomena. For instance, let's examine the question, what's the meaning of life? Well, this is certainly a thought-provoking question. It's not one that's easily answered. Its answer would likely be based on your individual values or beliefs, so the answer would vary greatly depending on the person doing the answering. So while this might be a good question for a philosophy or religion class, it's not the best question to be answered through science. What about the question, what's the best brand of sunscreen? This is a better scientific question. However, it's still a bit vague and leaves room for personal interpretation. Best could mean cheapest, highest SPF value, best smelling, or most likely to say animal swimming. Consider the question, which sunscreens have the highest SPF? This question is better, as it can easily be answered through direct observation. You just look at the available sunscreens in the store and compare their SPF values. But this question is a basic data collecting question. While it's useful in building knowledge, it doesn't require any explanation or experimentation, so the question can still be improved upon. How about this? Do sunscreens with higher SPFs block more UV light than sunscreens with lower SPFs? This is an example of a good scientific question. It isn't based on values or opinions. It examines the relationship between SPF and the amount of blocked UV light. It can be investigated through a controlled experiment, and the results can be quantifiably measured and interpreted.
Okay, now let's go to slide 3. There are 3 types of investigation: descriptive, comparative, and experimental. Let's look at each one individually. Okay. Types of investigations. Descriptive investigations. These use careful observations and measurements to develop descriptive findings about an organism, substance, reaction, or natural process, including the following parts of scientific inquiry: observation, a scientific question, procedure, use of graphs, data analysis, and a conclusion. Descriptive investigations do not include hypothesis or predictions, and they can't be identified using the following keywords: observe, describe, list, and identify. An example of descriptive investigations would be during a laboratory investigation, Cole was trying to determine which foods contain starch. He had 3 unknown food samples. He placed 1 gram of each food sample into separate test tubes. Then he added 2 drops of iodine to the test tube. The food samples that contained starch turned black when the iodine was added. Descriptive other examples. In science class, Maria was studying the vascular system of plants. She cut the bottom off a stalk of celery and then placed the celery in colored water. She left the celery in the cup for 24 hours. When she observed the celery, she noticed that there were colored tubes in the celery stalk. When she knew that was eczema tissue, she cut off a piece of the celery and observed it under a dissecting microscope and drew her observations. Another type is comparative investigations. This involves collecting data on different organisms, objects, features, or collecting data under different conditions, such as time of year, temperatures, or locations, to make comparisons. Involve looking for patterns or trends by comparing similarities and differences over time and under various circumstances. They do include the following parts of scientific inquiry: observation, scientific research question, a hypothesis, procedure, variables, both independent and dependent, data, graphs, analysis, conclusions. They do not include a control group, and they can be identified by using the following keywords: compare and contrast, similarity and difference, and categorize. An example would be comparing two different types of leaves to see which one has a greater rate of transpiration. Here is an example of a comparative investigation. In science class, Jackson learned that the underside of many leaves contains structures called stomata. Water vapor and other gases exit the plant through the stomata. Jackson wondered if the leaves of the hibiscus plant or the leaves from an ivy plant had more stomata. He used clear fingernail polish to paint a 2 centimeter square area on the underside of each leaf. Then he placed clear packing tape on each painted area and lifted the tape and removed an impression of the leaf. He placed the clear packing tape on microscope slides and then observed the impressions and counted the number of stomata on each leaf. Another example would be Meredith's experiment of light versus no light. She completed an investigation involving earthworms. She placed a worm on a moist paper towel and carefully marked the position of the worm on the paper towel. She placed a cardboard box over the worm and paper towel and left it undisturbed for 10 minutes. She removed the box and noted that the worm had not moved from its original position. Then she took a flashlight and shined it on the worm for 10 minutes. At the end of 10 minutes, she measured the distance the worm had moved in centimeters. And the third type of investigation are experimental investigations. These involve a process in which a fair test is designed and variables are actively manipulated, controlled, and measured in an effort to gather evidence to support or refute a causal relationship. Involve determining how a variable affects a control and experimental group. These include the following parts of scientific inquiry: observation, scientific research question, hypothesis, procedure, variables, both independent and dependent, control and experimental group, data, graph, analysis, and a conclusion. This type of investigation can be identified using the following keywords: control and experimental groups, constants, testing the effects of, or an example would be testing to see how the height of a ramp affects how far a marble will roll. An example would be Robert was asking to determine how temperature affects enzyme activity. Robert tested the potatoes under 3 different conditions: potatoes at room temperature, potatoes that have been placed in an ice bath, and potatoes that have been placed in boiling water. The potatoes at room temperature served as his control group. He counted the bubbles that formed to determine enzyme activity. Another example is Caitlin's performed an investigation in order to determine how pH affects the germination rate. She germinated bean seeds under 3 different conditions. The first one using distilled water with a pH of 7, second a solution of pH of 5, and third a solution with a pH of 3. The beans in the distilled water served as her control group. The beans were given the same amount of light, the same amount of liquid, and grow in the same containers. So once you've chosen a topic of interest, you need to think about and create a scientific question. Without a good question, your investigation is going to be much harder. So here are some examples. Changing science fair ideas into good testable question. Your topic could be music on animal behavior. And a possible question could be, how does music affect animal behavior? Or number 2, maybe your topic is child-proof containers and locks. Question is, how effective are child-proof containers and locks? So turning it into a question will help guide your research and experiment. So here are some different types of research questions depending on the type of investigation you wish to use. Descriptive investigations, here are some possible questions. Comparative investigations and experimental investigations. And some questions, more questions. An example of questions testing friction. 1, how does the texture of a ramp affect the distance traveled by a car? Or, number 2, how does the weight of the car affect the distance traveled? Or, number 3 could be, how does the height of a ramp affect the distance traveled by the car? So, here are some examples of testing questions under sound. When making a toy drum, how does the material of the shell of the drum affect the sound the drum makes? Or, when making a toy drum, how does the material of the drum head affect the sound of the drum? And 3, still on sound. When making a toy drum, how does the material of the tip of the beater affect the sound of the drum makes? Or lastly 4, how does the amount of water in a bottle affect the sound it makes? This shows you can come up with different questions for the same topic. Other examples, how does water purity affect surface tension? When is the best time to plant soybeans? Which material is the best insulator? How do different foundations make up earthquakes? How does the amount of heat affect cake batter? And how does the length of the copper wire affect the amount of light energy produced? And here are some other examples. Now it's your turn. So, using the attached graphic organizer and note taker, you're going to fill in the selected topic of interest in the bubble map that is in your note taker and write. Here are examples. Does running, if your interest is sports, A could be, does running in the morning increase my heart rate more than running in the evening? Or, how does the type of music someone listens to while running affect their speed? Okay? So as you go into your Google Classroom for Science, you will have this attached to fill out and turn in to your teacher. For additional possible questions, under Day 9, you have support, possible investigation questions. So here are some other examples that you can use to help guide your decision making in writing a testable question to your chosen topic. Happy learning!